Yeah, this is Mervin Backman. I'm going to reminisce a little bit about different things that happened in my early life. I was born in Barrett, Minnesota in 1913 on July 18th. My mother was Anna Matilda Johnson before she was married. My dad was Nels Justinus Bachman. And at the time I was born in Barrett, my folks lived in Canada, and where my dad was working, he did some farming, and then he ran a big thrashing rig. And the reason they came down to Barrett was so that I would be a citizen of the United States, because they planned on moving down back to the United States later on. And my dad's folks were born in the United States, but they were Swedes. They were both Swedes. My dad's father's name was John Bachman, and I never knew him real well. He was, at one time they were in Minnesota, and then they moved to Canada. And I think he passed away in flu epidemic in 1918. And my grandmother, as I remember, I think her name was Anna Bachman. She passed away in 1923, and the reason I didn't know them too well is they lived in Canada. They moved up to Canada around the 1905-6 or something like that, and they started farming up in Canada, and they finally told my dad he should come up there. My dad, before this, had been a mail carrier, and used to carry mail on the route first with a bicycle, and then as the mail got heavier, he went to a motorcycle, and then later on used horse and buggy or horse-driven type of a deal, mostly until later in the 20s. And when he was riding his motorcycle, he was courting my mother, and one time he took her for a ride, and her mother had forbidden her to ride on a motorcycle, but she went anyway, and when they were riding, her dress got caught in a chain and got ripped up, and she was pretty scared that her mother would really give her a rough time when she got home. So then she had her talked her sisters into repairing the dress, and they never knew anything that had happened. But anyway, my mother's folks were born and raised in Grant County. Neither one of them were, they were both Norwegians. They were born in this country too. Neither one of them were born in the old country. And my grandfather's name was Reinhardt. And they had a farm over west of Barrett. And farmed there till I think it was in the early 20s. My grandmother Johnson died, and then my grandpa Johnson, from then on, he came and he lived with us for a long time, and he used to help. What my dad would do, he'd buy wood so that my grandfather, or his dad and my grandfather, would have something to do. So he'd split wood, and just kept him busy, and he went back and forth between there and stayed with Natrix when they lived in Dawson. And later on in the 20s, when he was staying at Natrix, he fell on the stairway and got hurt, and finally this is what caused him to pass away. Anyway, my folks, a year or so after I was born, they lived in when they were in Canada, they lived in a real small house, and even though it was just a practically one room downstairs, one room upstairs, they used to have a teacher that came there and boarded with him that taught the country school. And when he was there, he got, when my mother came back up to Canada with me, he was always working, trying to get me to walk. And about the last week at school, he kept coaxing me enough, so I guess I took my first steps. And then finally we moved back down to the United States, and then my dad got a job with a Case tractor company at Fargo, and he worked there quite a few years, and then he got a job at working in the mill at Barrett, Minnesota. They ground flour there with a water-driven mill. And then finally, and during this time, he finally was offered a job in Elk Lake working for the O&M company, his Osprey Mill and Elevator Company in Elk Lake, and that was about, I think, in 1917 or something like that. And well, in the meantime, I had a sister, Rose, that was younger than I was, and we got, I think it was about 1916, we both got black measles, and when we were visiting at Richard Johnson's, of Barrett, and she passed away, and we were both very sick, but she passed away, and then we moved to Elk Lake. In the meantime, my dad, when he first got his job in working for the elevator in Elk Lake, we still lived in Barrett, so for a long time, when the weather was right, he'd walk back and forth to Elk Lake on the railroad grade. He didn't have a car and didn't have anything else to drive with, and that's finally we moved to Elk Lake, I think, in about 1918. He took over the elevator, and that's when the flu epidemic came through, and we all got sick at that time. I had a sister name of Ione, and then sister named Evelyn, and we all were sick. My mother and dad were sick too, but my dad tried to go back to work, and then he got a relapse and was laid up for many weeks after. And then in the meantime, Ione got sick, got double pneumonia, and along with the flu, finally she passed away too, and we lived in an apartment right across the street. And then he kept working he finally got back to work with the elevator, and then we I think it was we worked there through the 20s, and I think one time we took a trip to Canada to visit his brother George Backman. He lived in Canada. He lived at Mydale, where the rest of my dad's folks lived. There was an Alice Backman, and there was an Olga, and different ones. And we went up there in I think in 1925 Ford Touring, and on the way up I had Harvey. I had another two brothers by that time, Harold and Harvey, and he was just a baby at the time we went up there. He's 6 weeks old. And on the way up there, he got convulsions in one place, and finally we stayed with some people up in, I think, someplace in North Dakota for a while, and then when he got feeling better, then we went up to Canada. And the roads were so bad in some places in Canada that Dad would get out and walk across the river. It's just where the road was. A lot of places the water was over the road, and he'd walk across the river and see if it was okay to get across. And then we went up, visited Miledale, and the things that I remember up there was that a few things I did remember was that the town was pretty bare, and they had wood sidewalks. I can remember that. We used to walk on the wood sidewalks and get quite a kick out of that. Another thing that happened in the 1920s, my dad was a great baseball enthusiast and was interested in many sports. And I can remember at the elevator there that a bunch of businessmen got together and they built a tennis court right on the elevator land, and it was a beautiful court. It had high 10-foot fences around it, I imagine, and he played with Dr. Reeve and a guy named Solberg and different ones around town. It's hard to imagine that he was that active, but he was real active. And another thing in the 20s, he was a manager of a baseball team for about 3 years, so that's all we did for about 3-4 years was go and watch baseball games every Sunday. And Al Blake had one of the best teams in the country. Al Blake and Wendell, Ashby, all had good baseball teams. And we had a salaried battery pitcher and catcher that came from the cities. The catcher is named Cole, and the pitcher is Torwick, I think his name was, Torwick. And they used to come every Saturday, and they stayed at our place overnight, and then in the day, and I don't know how much money they received, but they were actually salaried. The rest of them weren't. And at the same time, they had built a beautiful baseball field in south of the tracks in Elk Lake. There was once a dump ground, and after in early 1920s, they filled this and made a beautiful amphitheater out of it, because it was a natural amphitheater with the slopes going up on all sides of it, and then trees. People sat under the trees, and we had many good, wonderful baseball games where the park was absolutely jammed with cars, even around on the outside. And I remember one time we went to Bertha to play Bertha, and they had a Negro pitcher. His name was John Donaldson, maybe one of the best. Would have been in a top league pitcher if he'd have been in later on, and when they allowed blacks into he was a Negro, so he couldn't play in organized baseball, but he played in this unorganized team at Bertha. And he was just a terrific, he could do anything. He could pitch, he could hit, he could hit just as good as he could pitch, and it was really an interesting thing. And I think we got kind of tired of watching baseball, because that's about all we did every Sunday for, I'd say, 3 years. But it was a time that I think was real interesting. And as it got towards the end of the 20s, of course, things were getting tough. I think I remember one time when my dad bought a new 1929 Chevrolet, a 4-door. It's the first Chevrolets or practically the first cars that come out with anything but black paint on. This is a two-tone green, beautiful car. And I can still remember that just like yesterday when we got that. And as we went into the 30s, of course, that's when the Depression came along, and I graduated in June of 1931, and a few days after I graduated, my dad fell in an elevator and was hurt real bad, and it was laid up for quite a few years. And the only thing that seemed like he didn't get much help from the doctors or anybody, and my mother pretty well nursed him, and he by himself, he had a broken back, and he was paralyzed on the right side, his right arm and his right leg, and he just laid and finally got out in the yard in the summertime and worked with his hands and made birdhouses and kept working till finally he completely, I think in about 1935, 36, he was completely able to, work at, completely healed himself with really no help from any doctors, because he was, at the time there was so much corruption, it seemed like, in workman's comp, they thought he would be a invalid all his life, and so they just made off like there was nothing wrong with him, and this went through the courts, and we didn't have the money to fight it with, and they finally said that he was just faking it. And so it, more or less through my mother's help and nursing and through his terrific will to get well, he finally got over it entirely and was able to work and do most anything. He never did go back into the elevator. He stayed in the, more or less started working with carpentry work, and then at the same time we didn't have much money, and then the CCs started, Civilian Conservation Corps, so I went, 1933, I went up to Side Lake and was in a CC camp there for about 5 years, and I did every type of work there, and really enjoyed it. And what little money I did, I sent home and helped my folks. Nobody really had anything then. The farmers were pretty much destitute. They had something to eat. That's about all you could say for them. And then later on, in I think about 1939, to get some kind of a job, I went down to the cities and worked in the truck garden and different things, and around the cities, and then went down and worked at Le Sueur and picked corn, did different things till I got just about wore me out. But and for the amount of money you got then, I think we got 20 or 25 cents an hour, and then you had to pay room and board out of that, so they didn't really amount to much what you got. And just like back in the 30s too, I used to help different people when I got out of the CC's, help in harvest and stuff like that, and usually you got $1 a day hauling bundles and things like that. But what we appreciated most when we were doing that was the good meals we used to get. I mean, you'd look forward to the lunch in the morning and the good dinners they had, and then one farmer would try to outdo the other at thrashing time, because it was almost like a festival. In fact, sometimes people look forward to it just like it was a carnival or something, and everybody, other women, my mother used to go out and help, and when we were out at Will Coleman's there, and help with cook, and they had lots of reason they had a lot of people there was because it took so many bundle teams, and everything was done by horse, and then horse and wagon, and hay racks, and grain was all the same way. And the steam rig we worked with was a big steam engine with a big separator, and that's it seemed like that was the amount of work that a person could get, and you had to take anything you get as long as you could more or less get a good meal out of it. It meant a lot. And then, of course, then I started 39. I worked for the county for a couple of years, just mostly in the summertime. And that was a pretty low-paying job too. And then in June of 1941, I was drafted in the service. What? Yeah, while we were sitting here, I got thinking of two different things that happened to me back in the late 20s. I wasn't very old then, I suppose 12 or 13, and my dad was working at the elevator and had the car parked on the other side of the elevator, and I was really interested in cars at the time. And so he would let me drive because I was too young, and so I'd go out and I'd sit in the car and just start it and back it up and go ahead a little bit and back it up and go ahead. And first thing I knew, I wouldn't go ahead or back, and so then I just got out of the car. And later my dad came out to take the car and wouldn't do nothing. So he had it checked out and found out an axle was broken. I guess what I'd done, I don't remember if I was real rough on it or not, but anyway, it was a characteristic of this. I think it was a Chevrolet at that time. It had axles that really cracked and they crystallized and cracked and broke. But anyway, I don't know if I ever dared tell him or not. I can't remember that. And another thing that happened at the time we were at the elevator too, I used to hang around the elevator a lot too, and I'd help him a lot to clean out bins in the elevator and help farmers come in there and sack up coal. They'd buy coal in sacks at that time, maybe help them get some flour. We sold flour at a flour shed too and different things. Anyway, I was still interested in this car business, so one day the car was sitting out there and I was going to start it up and just see if I just hear it run, and I was really interested in them. And on this car, I think it was a Ford we had that time, and then he had to retard the spark on it before he cranked it, as the crank didn't have a starter. And I went out and forgot to retard the spark and was going to crank the car, and the first thing I knew, it kicked, and I looked at my arm and it was all bent over. I knew something was wrong, so I went into my dad in the office, told him I thought my arm was broke, and he said, well, just don't bother me. He was busy. There was full of farmers in there, and then he finally took a look at me, and the arm was all bent over, and he just really moved then, because he knew then that I really had broke my arm. And we went up to, I think Doc Parson, he just moved into Elbow Lake. He used to be at Wendell. And I went up there, and they had me waiting and waiting and waiting. By that time, it was starting to really hurt pretty bad. And then he came, and then at that time they used chloroform instead of ether, and so he put me to sleep. And I can remember when I came to, the arm was set and then a splint, and it didn't hurt anymore. And I remember I felt that it didn't even seem to hurt anymore after that. I don't know if it ever bothered me much after that, except it was tough to do anything with a splint on my arm. Just cut it off again. Another thing I remember that happened, this was something that happened back in about 1923. We had one of the worst snowstorms that we'd ever had, and it was just snow everywhere, and it was snow deep enough. We were living down in the west end of Elbow Lake at that time. We were living in our Grandpa Johnson was living with us that time too, and we used to make caves around there and different things, and under the snow, and it was so much snow that actually there wasn't any. The only thing that got through, actually, I think for weeks and weeks, were the trains. They got through, but the cars, there's very few cars that were in and out of Elbow Lake for just weeks and weeks after the storm, because it was just drifts 10, 12 feet high, and just terrible. A lot of people died, and I remember one time, our main sport on Saturdays would be to ride bobsleighs, because it was all bobsleighs and cutters, which are small sleds with fast running horses on, and then bobsleighs with more or less the workhorses. And one time a farmer came into town, and I and another kid caught the bobsled, jumped to the way you do. You'd ride on the runners were pretty high on a bobsled, so you could stand on the bob and then hang on to the side of the box and ride along. And we used to do this lots of times. We'd maybe ride on the country 4 or 5 miles and catch on and ride back in on a Saturday. But anyway, we did it this day, and his farmer was had a turkey in a cage, big tom, and when we jumped on there, the tom got excited and busted the crate and blew out, and the horses started to run away. And we couldn't get off because they were moving so fast, so we had to stay on the sleigh. And by the time we got uptown, that was about 3-4 blocks from where we jumped on. The snowbanks were so big on the side of the road that when he just got up to the main street of town, he turned the horses right into the snowbank and stopped them. And of course, we just took off and run. But he was a pretty mad farmer, I'll tell you that. But actually, it didn't. Nothing happened. But what the runaway did could have been pretty serious. It was a pretty exciting ride for us, and but you talk about entertainment. That was a big entertainment then, as well as another thing we did at that time. Of course, it was. I think I don't know if we had a radio then or not. I think it was about 19. I think about the only radios there were then was a lot of people had crystal sets, just small crystal sets, and you could pick up a station. In fact, there was one of the first stations that started was a little station started at Barrett, Minnesota. That was the first radio station, and it was KDGE, I think. It was Kill Dull Gloomy Evenings was what the letter stood for. And you could get that on crystal set, because the crystal set, all you did was a little crystal, and you moved a needle around, and you used earphones and to pick it up. But I think it was later, I think about 1925, before there was any radios that I could remember of that started coming out with. I remember we had an Atwater Kent, I think one of the first decent radio. It had a metal cabinet, and it had a metal speaker that sat on top of it. And that was a first nice radio that seemed like we had. There was some that you had to tune in with many different dials. You had to tune in about 3 different dials to get the station to come in. In fact, there was a few stations then that, like I say, that one at Barrett, and that was a good station. And that's the one that actually is in Fergus Falls now. That moved from Elbow Lake, or from Barrett to Fergus Falls, I don't know how many, when was it moved there. It was a Barrett an awful long time. And another thing, it would keep us busy back, and we did lots of skating. And there was a kid in Elbow Lake, Harry Anderson. We used to call him Chris. He was a good friend of mine, and we both loved to skate. And we'd go down, and sometimes just the two of us, we'd clean off a spot on the lake and skate, and pretty soon there'd be others. And we used to play hockey down there, and that was, we really enjoyed that. And we seemed like skating was a big deal in it. That was a big deal for many years. Sometimes the lakes would freeze over real smooth, and you could skate over the whole lakes, and used to skate at night, and really there were lots of enjoyable times on skating. That's about, nobody had any money to do much of anything else. And as far as other entertainment, it seems like, as I remember it, through the 30s and that, there wasn't much money to do anything with, and just going and visiting was about the only thing that we do. My dad was a great one to try, and it seemed like we used to have relations at Barrett and Natwicks lived there, and Richard Johnson's, and we'd go visiting them a lot. And a lot of times the roads were so bad then, there wasn't any decent roads really, and you get there, you'd have to drive on plowed fields and cross cornfields. Most of the time the roads themselves had banks on the side they'd fill in, but if you'd stay out in the fields where the wind would blow the snow off, well, you could make it. So a lot of times my dad would be the first one to go through, make the run from Elbow Lake to Barrett, and he'd open the road many times, and to do this, all we used to have was the old Model T. At that time, I think we had a Model T, I think 1926 Model T it was a 4-door sedan, and it was a pretty blame nice car at that time. And of course, with a Ford transmission, it worked with bands, and you had low bands and reverse bands, and it's much like it was a kind of the forerunner of the automatic transmission that you use today. I remember one time we were coming from Barrett, and it was getting quite late, and there was a little town of Thorsberg east of Elbow Lake, where it used to be the Great Northern used to go through, and there was a little station there, and but as you come down in across this railroad track, it was quite a dip, and snow would fill in there, and that was maybe the worst part of the whole road from Elbow to Barrett. And one time we came back, and it was getting dark, and we came to this dip across there, and of course we got about halfway through it, and the blame bands on the car started loosening up, so it didn't have any power, and right in the snowbank there, I had to get out and tighten the low bands in the car so we get enough traction to get out of there. And I remember we had a whole bunch of, all us kids were along, and I suppose there was five kids along with my mother and dad, and there we sat in that car. In those days you didn't have no heaters, you know. And I remember when we got home, we had lost mittens and even overshoes, I think, in the deal there when we were trying to get out of that place. But we made it out of there, and it seems like those are the things. Another entertainment we used to do is, a lot of times the entertainment was to do with playing in snow in wintertime. Did a lot of sliding and went bobsled riding. Sometimes it's the only way we could get into some of these farms with a bobsled in the wintertime. They'd go into town and back out again, and I know we used to go out and visit different people, and they'd come and maybe pick us up in a bobsled, and after we drove so far we couldn't get any farther, they'd take us with the bobsled and he'd take us in and then later take us back out again. Yeah, another thing I remember about as far as entertainment, I can remember when we were back in the 20s, we used to go out and stay at the lake a lot of times, and a lot of times one time we lived in 2 tents out at 10 Mile Lake. We had one tent facing the other and then a little overhang in the middle, and we had a little table in there, and my dad would come out every evening. He'd work in town and then he'd come out in the evening, and we stayed out 10 Mile, I think, there all one summer. And I used to work for, well, at that time it was for Huskies, I think, the name of and I used to trim trees for them and different things, and this way I made a little extra money and kept ourselves busy. And a lot of times we stayed in different lakes. We stayed on Pomme de Terre Lake one summer and for a month or so, and then we stayed at Barrett Lake. There was a uncle of mine named Halverson. He had a cottage down there, and we rented that, I think, for a month or two one summer. And so in this way I got to be a pretty good swimmer by being around the lakes a lot, and it seemed like that was another thing that everything was pretty simple back in those days. There wasn't, your entertainment is what you made of it, and but it seems like most of the entertainment was just what you created yourself, and visited other people, and just in fact, seems like goes months and months of trying to recall something we did, and really we didn't do much of anything. It seemed like we still seemed to enjoy life pretty much, and then another thing, just before talking about snowstorms, we were in Armistice Day in 1940. We were living in Elbow Lake at the time then too, and we lived up east of town, and of course that was another terrific storm, and maybe somewhat similar to that in 23. I think only maybe got colder in this Armistice Day, and we were living up, like I say, east end of town there, and of course the first thing that happened, and storm come, I knocked out the lights, and we didn't have anything to do to see by, so I walked downtown to a store that owned by a guy named Nell Solberg, and was going to buy some candles, and he lived above the store, but I went up to ask him if he'd come down. He said no, it's too bad. He didn't think he could make it downstairs because it was storming so bad and so cold. I finally talked him into doing it, and so I got him, and then I went back home, and I don't think there was another person out of town, out of the house in the whole town, and if anything would have happened, I suppose I would have. It was quite a few blocks back home. I remember walking down and coming up the last hill up the towards the house there's an old underpass there, and it's still there, I guess, under the Sioux Line track. And walking up that hill, I didn't know if I'd make it or not. But it seems like there was lots of times when it seemed to have such bad storms and nothing really to continue. I think this kept up for about 2-3 days. In fact, the day the storm really originated by the same kid, this Harry Anderson. It was getting towards the end of duck season, and he called me up and he said, I think it's supposed to be an awful good duck hunting day tomorrow. And so I said, okay, I'll come over and pick you up. And I had an old Chevrolet, I guess, and about a 31, 32. It was pretty nice little car. But I went down there and picked him up, and I told him I thought it looked like it was going to be a pretty tough day. Oh, he said the ducks are really flying today. And we went out in Sandy Point and Palmy Terror Lake. And when we got out there, it was getting worse all the time. And to get down into this place, you got to go down a hill to get down there. And we went out towards the point, and about that time, it was really storming. So in fact, a duck couldn't even flew in it because it just was. The wind had come up and the snow was starting to really come down, so we decided we better get out of there before when we could still get out of there. So we went and we started going up the hill, and we couldn't make it up the hill. And we looked around and we seen a kid swing there, so we went over there and we cut the ropes off the swing, and there were spoke wheels on the car, so we wrapped this rope around the tires and finally made it up the hill and started back to town. And we were going pretty good till we got right north of town, and we had a big snowbank and we got stuck, and we went in. There was a farm house real close, so we went up there and asked them if they'd come out and see if they could pull us out of that snowbank, and because he had a team of horses. And farmer's wife said no, he wasn't going to go out because it was too blame windy and cold. But he said, well, you can't leave him out there either. So he hitched up the team and come out and pulled us out. In a little while we were gone up to the house. We come back and the car was practically half full of snow. It blew right in. I suppose maybe it wasn't too tight anyway. But we got it started again. And then we got into town, and we got right in Main Street at Alba Lake in front of what used to be the Cozy Corner. And there we got stuck, and then there was a car set there for 3 days. It stormed it was about 3 days before we could go down and dig the car out. It was right in the middle of the main street. But that was maybe one of the worst storms as far as cold. It just came so quickly, and there was a lot of duck hunters out that same day like we were, because the day before was a beautiful day. In fact, it was just a balmy day the day before. And so there was down in the cities, there was a lot of them down in the flats along the Mississippi hunting, and many of them were killed because they couldn't get out of there. They couldn't see, and they finally froze to death. So that was a really, really a bad deal. And that was that same spring then, like I say before, that it was the next year, and 41 now I was drafted in the service, and I went down to Fort Snelling, and then went through some basics there, and then finally one day they woke us up in the morning and said, well, you're bunch are going to Leonard, Missouri, and bunch are going to McCord Field, Washington. Leonardwood, Missouri was an infantry camp, and McCord Field was Air Force. When they come to lining us up, boy, I was one of the lucky ones that got to go out to McCord Field. And I think 100 of us went out there, and 700, I think, went to Leonardwood. And so we got out there, McCord Field, Washington, and then we worked on, from then on, I worked on planes, and then that, that fall, I got a chance to go to school, and I went to school in Kansas City, Missouri for 6 months as a Air Force mechanic school, and this was a real good school, and we had a good deal there. We stayed right in one of the hotels, and that was one of the, see, at that time they were anticipating war, so they were starting to train, and we were the third class going through this Air Force training mechanic school, and then it come towards Christmas on December 7th, and we were all signed up to go home for Christmas leave, and then when we were downtown, we heard that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor, and that we graduated in the spring. Then we went back out to McCord Field, and we worked on, when we were out in McCord Field, we worked on 2 old bombers that were pre-war bombers. They were twin engine. That's all we had to work on, was 2 ships, and but we kept working on those, and then all of a sudden we heard we were going to be shipped out, and we ended up at that's when they formed the 12th bomb group, which consisted of 4 squadrons. Each squadron was maybe 250 men. And we were shipped then down to Esra Field, Louisiana. And there we started. They come in with B-25s, and that's when we started working with B-25 airplanes. And then we kept training on those, and then in June of '42, we were shipped to East Coast, and right north of New York, and then we were in a debarkation center then for a while, and then we finally were loaded on the Louis Pasteur. It was a French liner that was taken over by the English after the war was declared. It was going to be a luxury liner, but it was converted to a troop carrier. And on this troop carrier, we had, I think, we had a fighter group, a medium bomber group, which I belonged to, which was ours, and then a heavy bomber group, which is B-24s, and all the mechanics and all the personnel for these 3 groups were on this ship. And it was a fast ship, so we weren't, it was a ship, we got air patrol, air cover for quite a ways out, and at that time the Germans were sinking boats all over the place because they were pretty much in control with their U-boats and stuff outside on the Atlantic coast, and we got out. We had air cover then as far as they could still fly it, and then we were on our own, and 31 days later we arrived at Port Suez in Egypt, And there we were attached to the British Desert Air Force, which was flying out of Egypt at that time. They were flying with the Air Force. They were flying airplanes out there. And of course, then we hadn't even got our airplanes yet. Then we were the ground force, and then they flew the airplanes over. And then, of course, Montgomery, he was a British commander of the complete African war, and he led. We went down. Our planes went across the Libyan desert, and the Germans were drove back, and we finally ended up at Tripoli and North Africa. And then from there, they took the island of Catania, or island of Sicily rather, and we were stationed around Catania. And then when they got a foothold in Italy, well, then we went into Italy and flew out of Foggia, Italy. And when we'd been over 18 months, well, then they said it was an 18-month theater, so we thought we were going home. And then when we went back up to Egypt again by ship again. We got there and they said we were going to India. So I think it was a week or two later we ended up in Bombay, India, and then we went to Calcutta, and then we had an airfield north of Calcutta, and we flew out of there out of running low emission. We still had B-25s, but they were different models. These were equipped with recoilless 75mm cannon in the front, as well as lots and lots of 50 caliber machine guns, both in fixed and flexible positions. So we flew out of there we flew in India for. I never flew on combat any time. I was in the States. I flew as an engineer, but when I got overseas, they wouldn't let me fly combat because I wore glasses. But we always flew on our ships. I was crew chief on a plane from Egypt all the way to Italy, and then all the time we were in India. So every place the plane went, every time we moved, I moved by plane. And then I got lots of trips. A lot of times we had trips. We had to go to gunnery school or something, and a ship would go. I'd go along with it as a mechanic. So I got lots of rides, even though I didn't fly any missions. And then in 1945, I think when we were coming back home, and I came back home in May of 45, and on the way home, when we stopped at Brisbane, Australia, B Day was over then, and when we were in Brisbane, then when we were tied up there, that's when we heard that President Roosevelt died. And then when we were tying up in Brisbane, one of the ship's propellers hit some piling or something and bent it. They didn't really know it was bent till we got out in the ocean again. And of course, we were still at war with Japan. And there we were out there putting along, and all of a sudden the whole ship started shaking because his rudder was out of alignment, and they put divers over the side and checked it out, and they found out that they couldn't run it, so we more or less run on one prop. We had two props. Limped along, and there we were. We were still in pretty much waters that could have been controlled by or maybe were controlled somewhat by the Japs yet. But although we still didn't have any cover with us. We didn't have any convoys, and so this was kind of a time that we were wondering if we were going to make it after we'd been overseas for 3 years, and whether we were going to get sunk by a Jap when we couldn't get the ship couldn't get any speed on the ship. But we finally limped back into San Pedro. That's where we docked, San Pedro, California, and then we were released from, or sent back to Fort Snelling. So, and it was about almost 4 months or 4 years to the day since I was inducted. I spent a year in the States and 2 years overseas. It was we made a lot of good friends, though. At the time we were in service, most of us served all the time together, and being we were very fortunate. A lot of times there was other groups that were, especially when we were in the Living Desert, there was lots of crews that were strafed and bombed that seemed like we were just luckier than heck, and we had a lot of planes went over, but we were lucky to never got bombed as a ground crew. And but we had a lot of good times. We improvised a lot, and just by good companionship we had lots of interesting times. And and other things that we did when we were overseas for entertainment was just actually, we had so many people that could improvise. We'd maybe go out to I remember one time when we were out in the Living Desert, and we had a guy named Walter Kikas from the cities. He was our propeller specialist. He was in the tent, and then there was Walter Viken, that was another crew chief, and we all lived in the same tent. And there was, around where we were, there was so many airplanes and tanks that had been destroyed on the push from Egypt when they pushed the Germans back, and there was German tanks all over. There was airplanes, there was parts for everything. And this Walter Kikas, he went out one time and he took a generator off a tank, and then we found an old Briggs & Stratton gas engine, and we made our own 12 volt light plant. So we were the only tent in the whole area that had lights, and we used just 12 volt bulbs, but we still had enough lights so we could see. And then another thing we do, they never give us, in fact, out in the desert it'd get pretty cold at night, even though in days, of course the Living Desert isn't as warm as the Sahara, but it still was get warm and then be cool at night. And so we'd even make up our own stoves of different types. But I know another thing, it seemed like with this particular group of us, we'd get a lot of things that would make ourselves more comfortable. And I know as we moved up in different, what we were stationed at out in the Living Desert was what they call landing LGs, landing grounds. In other words, they were make a field 12 mile by mile square and just take road graders and level it off, and that was a field. It didn't take any more than that to do. And then they'd bring in tents, and we had mess tents. We lived in tents, and then they'd just find areas, just parking areas for the planes, and then landing. The runaways were outlined so that they had certain places to, but I mean, it just more or less was a quickly done thing. And in the areas where we were, there was every nationality. There was South Africans, and there was Australians, there was British, there was Americans, everybody flying different airplanes, different types, but all under the District Air Force. And sometimes they'd get a little bit mischievous, and sometimes these pilots would get a little bored of what they were doing, and if they're up flying, sometimes they'd bust these different tents. And I remember getting up one morning and looking down a row of tents, and there I could see a plane coming. It looked like it was about 10 feet off the ground, and there it was, a fighter just buzzing our tents, and he went over the mess tent and just about wrecked it all. And that's what they do. One would go on. Of course, we had B-25s. You couldn't bombers, but you couldn't buzz anybody else. But the fighter planes, of course, were maneuverable, and they'd bring them right down to the deck. And that was it's just kind of a way, I suppose, to break the monotony of being out there and not much else to do. And yes, when we entered into the Tripoli area, why, these same three fellows, Kikas and Viken and I, we found a revetment where the British had a lot of motorcycle parts. We seen there was evidently, I don't know, they were all British motorcycles, and we actually, between the three of us, we made 2 complete motorcycles. And the roads around Tripoli were beautiful, and they had beautiful highways, and so we used to have a lot of fun just going up. Any free time we had, we'd take our motorcycles out and really have a time. And this kept going on and on and on until different guys bought motorcycles. There was British motorcycles, there was everything, and everybody was. Pretty soon there started to be a lot of accidents, because anytime you got motorcycles, and then you're going to have accidents. And we got more and more, so they finally wouldn't let anybody hit it. So we sold ours then to British soldiers. We sold both of them. And another deal that we did when we were in Foggia, Italy, was a terrible cold there, and we made improvised stoves too. And only trouble was we'd made drip oil stoves and different things, and they were if you didn't watch them, the first thing they do, they'd get too hot, and we burnt up a lot of tents. So it didn't ever hurt anybody, but it seemed like but at least we kept warm. We found scrap lumber, and we built floors for the tents. And it's surprising, with the amount of money spent, for wars and that, they didn't have anything really fit to heat the tents with. They didn't have, and at the time we were in Foggia, our infantry were fighting in the mountains north of Foggia, up towards Naples, and they were fighting up there without even any decent footwear, and there was lots and lots of casualties just on account of frostbite, because they didn't understand the country, they didn't have the clothing, the proper footwear. And we were down in Foggia where it was usually pretty good weather, but actually we had a terrifically cold winter the year we were there. And but that's what we did. And then of course there was different, they'd try and entertain you in different ways. We'd play maybe volleyball sometimes, and there was a lot of USO shows that came over, and we didn't see. Usually, we were on the move so much that usually about the time that they were scheduled to come in, we'd be on the move, and about maybe move the day before they come in. So we missed lots of them, but we did see some. In fact, we were watching a U.S. show in North Africa when the invasion of Sicily started, and actually we sat out there watching the movie when the C-47s with the paratroopers in them and then pulling gliders went over us by the hundreds. They just literally filled the sky, and they landed, and they really had a lot of problems coming into Sicily because they got fouled up with the Navy. Thought they were enemy, and they got some of them shot up, and then a lot of them had to crash in. A lot of gliders crashed in. A lot of people were killed in glider crashes and stuff, but it was an amazing sight where you could see just literally the sky covered with C-47s pulling gliders, and then they cut them loose when they got over Sicily, and the paratroopers jumped out of the C-47s, and the gliders had combat crews and landed as best they could. But that was actually at a time when we were there's a USO showing going on over there, so you can see that everything was happening. And Sicily was a beautiful, really a pretty nice island. We were located near Catania. In fact, we were located right in the edge of a almond grove, and there had been a big tank battle here, and the grove was pretty well shot up, but we could go out there and they'd back a truck against the trees and shake down the almonds, and then we'd crack them and then take them to our tents and get a frying pan and kind of roast them, and using kind of a butter type of deal they had. They had what they call a tropical butter for warm countries. In fact, it wasn't warm here, but I mean that's what this is for, and it worked good for that. And but these are the things that we done. It seemed like the time passed fast, even though. And then when we things we enjoyed in Italy was the fact that the people were so blame friendly and everything, and they'd invite us over, and sometimes we'd talk the cooks out of flour and different things. We'd take them to these Italian people, families, and they'd make spaghetti and noodles and make up enough for their family, feed their family, and then they'd invite us over, and then they'd have what they call the good old Dago red wine, which really went good with Italian food, and we enjoyed many times like that. And then another thing we did when we got over to, like I mentioned before, we went from Italy to Egypt to India, and when we got over in this big base in India, there we found bicycle parts, much the same way we found motorcycle parts over in Africa, around Tripoli, and we made, I think, several bikes so we could ride bicycle around there. And of course, when we were over in it was so terribly warm in India that we lived in what they call bashas, and they were bamboo buildings with a real heavy thatched roof, about a foot thick of more or less of grass laid and what they call a thatched roof, and which worked pretty well even when it rained. And these actually were pretty comfortable. I mean, they had a lot of ventilation through them, and the heat didn't come down through. But it'd get so hot in the daytime, a lot of times we couldn't work on airplanes in the daytime, so unless we could have them under some kind of cover, which was pretty hard. And so a lot of times we worked on airplanes at night because planes would get so hot in the daytime you couldn't work on them. And I know one time we were in India. I had a plane I was crew chief on. It was on a mission, and it blew a cylinder over Imphal, which is north of Calcutta, up near Burma. And the crew was picked up and brought back to our base, and then they sent me and my assistant crew chief up there to see if we could repair it, find out what was wrong with it and repair it. And so we went up there, and the plane had landed in what was actually a mud. It wasn't a hard surface field, it was more or less a mud surface. And there was a British ship called Wellingtons. They called them Wimpies. They were a twin-engine British ship, but they were a tail wheel type airplane. Ours was a nose wheel type, and they couldn't get speed enough. They had this thing ready to take off from the field, but it was too muddy. They couldn't take off. Well, we worked on this plane, I think, for 2-3 days. We had to work on it quite a while to get the cylinder off and find out what was wrong, and we found out the piston there was a hole burnt through the piston. We had to have a new piston, new cylinder. So then they flew that up, and we put this on. And when we were there, we had to sleep in the plane at night. That's the only place there was to sleep. We had sea rations to eat. And when the officers left, they gave us each one a 45. There were 45s when they left, and said that. And at the time we were there, this Imphal Valley was pretty well controlled by the Japs in the hills. And here we sat out there. We knew that other plane was there, but it was a British crew, but we wouldn't be much help to each other. Mosquitoes were terrible, about eat us up at night, and we finally got the plane repaired, and new cylinder and new piston and everything put on it. And then they were notified down at our base, and they come and sent up a pilot and a co-pilot to fly it out, or a pilot, and I think they had a radio man too. And these British people come around when the plane come, and they said, you'll never make it off the field, because well, of course we had what we call a nose wheel type of an airplane. The minute you get speed on the airplane, why the nose lifts. First thing that lifts is the nose, and then of course you got just the two main wheels. And we walked down through the field first to find out where the best spots were to take off from. I mean, where the least amount of mud holes were, and then they got in fact, we hadn't even run the airplane up. We didn't know for sure how good it even would run, because we just got it ready when the crew come. Or didn't have it ready, and we hadn't run the engine up even. But of course the pilots, they were pretty much of a bunch of daredevils anyway. They weren't scared of much anything, and they thought, well, if you think it's okay, we'll give it a try. Well, we thought we'd done it pretty good, and so they run the engines up to full power and held the brakes on them. And then with that type of an airplane, why, the minute you release the brakes and the power, the nose wheel lift right up, and then you're just on the main. And so we, in fact, took off, and maybe 600-700 feet we were in the air. These British people, they couldn't believe it. They, of course, they had a type of plane that just was impossible to get off with that wet of field. And then as we went around this Imphal Valley, it was we had monsoon weather up there, and there was a lot of storms would move in right away, and the minute we got off the ground, well, we seen a storm coming in. And we had to circle many times to get out of the valley, and we flew through rain. You couldn't see nothing, but these pilots did a good job, and they got us out of there. I think if we had what we called a B-25 bomber, it was a twin-engine bomber, medium range, and it was maybe one of the better planes for stability, and of all the planes we had. I know there was times when we had airplanes that would go on a mission and maybe get shot, one engine shot out, and they'd come back a couple hundred miles on one engine, and would practically one of these came back that way, and the engine was absolutely shot when they got down and blew all the rocker box gaskets out, and everything but it still was operating when it landed, so it got back. But we found many times that B-25 was a really good workhorse, as far as one of the better ones, and one of the most reliable ones. It would land at a little lower speed and could take off on shorter runways, and it seemed like it was adapted to most any type of terrain or any type of flying they wanted to use it in. Yeah, and when I came back from the service in 45, I hadn't been home too long, and I wasn't doing much of anything, and my dad, of course, he always liked to see us kids doing something, so after I'd been home a couple of months, he asked me if I wanted to go help him with carpenter work, and so I did, and then Harold was discharged, my old brother next to me, and he started working with us too, and so we started, did a lot of carpenter work, and we worked that fall, and then one day I was talking to the Lampert lumber company guy, and he says, "Why don't you get a lot and build a house yourself?" He said, "You can build we'd never built a house." And so we went up, and he helped me pick out a lot, and I got a GI loan of $5,000, and so we started building the house, and we got this, our house pretty well completed. We built it was kind of a story-and-a-half house with 2 bedrooms down, living room, kitchen, dinette, bath, and upstairs was a couple of bedrooms. And then there was a guy named Matt Farmer come to us one time and ask us if we'd want to build a house for him. And we asked him if we had any plans. "No, yeah, I have no plans." He says, "Maybe you can..." He dropped some crude ones and didn't really amount to much what he had there, so I drew up some plans for him. See if that's what he didn't want to build as big as ours, he wanted a little smaller. And so then we built their house for them too. We had never built houses before, but we built, and it worked out pretty well. And the only trouble was this carpenter work. We seemed to have a lot of work in the summertime, and then in the wintertime, there wasn't, you just about started it. So in the spring of 47, a friend of mine, Dave Nordholm, now Blake, came up to me and asked me if I wanted to go to work for the state in Morris, and I told him, well, I didn't even know what they were doing or what kind of work it was. And I told him, well, I'd go along with him. I went down there, and So I hired on as hourly and went out and started working on survey work and different things, and pretty soon I got appointment as a technician, and I stayed with the highway then, doing just about everything there was to do, from working at gravel producing plants, working on base work, grading work. Finally was worked on paving, and then I was head slab on paving job, and then they decided they wanted me to start me on some bridges. I started on working on bridges then, and first bridge I worked on was about 1949, and I'd never been around bridge work much, and but different guys helped me, and that went pretty good. So then, from then on, it was off and on. From as the bridge work come up, I'd work at different things in between time. I did some office work, some drafting, had some blacktop, box culvert work, curb and gutter work, different types like that. Put up radio towers, and was an inspector on them. And then there was a bridge coming up at Alexandria, a pretty big bridge, and going 29 north of Alexandria, so they put me on that, and then I started pretty much in bridges. And then I think it was 1954, then I got appointed as a civil engineer one, as a bridge inspector, and then I pretty much was on bridges from then on. And then in the later part of the 50s, I started working on getting registered as a highway engineer, and by going to school and taking correspondence courses and different things, I got finally okayed by the registration board that I could take the test. I took the registration test, and I think I passed it in about 1959 or sometime in there. But due to the fact that there was not many openings, it wasn't until 1964 I kept working as a bridge inspector during this time. 1964, the bridge engineer in Tri Lakes died of a heart attack, and I was on the project engineer list at the time, and was in bridge work, so I was appointed bridge engineer in 1964. This is just about the time the interstate system started out started building from Morad in our district, from Morad to Osakis, and so I took over, and there was just a few bridges going at the time. We didn't have too many people, and we finally got organized to a pretty good group, and then the interstate bridges started coming up by the dozens and dozens, and I moved into Alexandria in about 1965 and had an office there, and took care of some 23 bridges around Alec, and then some towards Fergus, some up towards Morad, some on 10 from Tri Lakes to Fargo, and this was a real busy time. And in 1967, I moved to office to Tri Lakes and stayed there working on bridges until 1977, and I retired, and in 1948 I was married to Lindia Malis, and we had 3 fine sons that are now grown up and married, all of them, and we have many social workers in the group, and some registered nurses, and seems like they are all doing well. And we, after I retired, I decided that it wasn't any use, just not too hard for me not to do something. So I took over a bridge for Clay County up in Moorhead over the Red River, and built that one year. And then I worked on some other projects, and then finally I decided it's too much work to be going over and too complicated work, so I just looked around for seeing if I could do something else, and then I started working for Douglas Marine Corporation out of Alexandria, and as a maintenance, take care of the lawns and shrubs. And when it got fall, I decided they'd like to have me do maintenance work and help in the machine shops and that. So I'm still doing that and enjoying it very much. Well, it's